Okay, so for my 6th and 7th graders, we are starting a new project this week, and it went up to a vote. And out of the choices that you guys were given, you chose to do a project about texture. Um, and before anybody starts drawing or thinking about what they're going to draw, we kind of want to talk about texture and what it means and how it's going to fit into this project. So, the basic definition of texture is something that you guys are probably familiar with by the time you get to middle school. So texture means how something feels. So in art, we're more accustomed to talking about our sense of sight. We're looking at things, we're observing things, we're drawing things. It's very visual activity. In this project, we are also going to have to call upon our sense of touch because obviously texture describes the way something feels when you touch it. But it gets a little bit more complicated than that. So the part that's not complicated is just the way that something feels when you touch it. So, if I pick up this dish, it's smooth, right? It's hard and it's smooth. If I pick up this orange, it's bumpy, right? I can feel the little bumps in the skin of the orange. If I pick up this piece of tissue paper, it's wrinkly or it's crinkly, right? So all these little adjectives that describe the way something feels, and there's a lot of variety, and we're pretty accustomed to that because humans reach out and grab things and hold things. If you've ever been around a small child, they're always reaching with their hands to pick up things that they're probably not supposed to. We're used to thinking about things in terms of touch. So that part's really easy. That is called a real texture. Okay? Like a texture that you feel. Okay? So you can touch it. It exists. It's a real thing. And it's part of like day-to-day life. Now, there is another kind of texture that is important to artists, and that is implied texture. So if I imply something, I'm kind of like hinting at it. I'm not saying it, but I'm hinting at it. So when we say implied texture, we're talking about a texture that we draw, but it's not a real texture. Because if I draw, a spiky texture on a smooth piece of paper, even if I make it look spiky, when I touch it, it doesn't feel spiky. It feels smooth because it's on a smooth piece of paper. So implied textures are, you could call them simulated textures, right? Because they look a certain way, but they don't feel that way. There are types of art or types of painting and drawing that produce a texture on the paper, right? So if I take an oil painting or an acrylic painting and I touch the actual surface of the painting, it does not feel smooth because the brush has left scratches and bumps and different grooves and textures in the paint that stayed there when it dried. Okay, so I can feel the texture of that painting. So that's like a real texture. But when we're working on a smooth piece of paper and we can't create an actual physical texture that people are going to touch, we have to simulate it. So that's an implied texture. Okay? Or a simulated texture. It's not real. And the important thing here is it doesn't feel the way it looks. So on a real texture, if I look at this orange and I say, oh, it looks bumpy, when I reach out and touch it, it's going to feel bumpy. On an implied texture, whatever kind of texture you're making, whether it's wrinkly or scratchy or lumpy, it's going to look that way. But if someone touches your paper, it's not going to feel that way. So you're creating an illusion, you're creating something that's not there, and that's a lot harder to do. So we're working with implied texture, but we're going to be looking at real texture. So we actually need both. So understand the distinction between these two types of texture. So you're going to observe a real texture, and as you guys read, or those of you who voted on the project, you read, the texture you're going to be looking at is the texture of an animal. So it doesn't matter what animal you pick, but the quality of the image you use to reference does matter, probably a lot, because this is all about detail. So if you look at a picture of an elephant or something, it's not enough to just draw a realistic outline of the elephant, an outline that looks pretty nice, so that has a lot of accuracy. You got to go into that outline or into that shape that you're drawing really realistically and pay a lot of attention to the detail of that texture. So in the case of that elephant, the wrinkles and the folds in its skin. And if you can't see those wrinkles in your reference, you can't draw them. So I don't want you to make up anything. I don't want you to imagine the texture of this animal. I want you to observe it, which means that you got to find a good reference. So you're going to be looking at a real texture. So you're going to be observing that, right? So observe a real texture, but you have to turn that real texture into an implied texture, because you can't create the texture on your paper, right? You could, if you had paints, depending on what kind of animal you were looking at, you could leave a texture in the paint with your brush. It would be really difficult, but you know, that is something artists do. But we're doing a drawing here, so you can't create a real texture. You have to use your skill at mark making to create an implied texture. So you're observing a real texture, and you're creating an implied texture based on that. So it seems like a pretty simple project, but there are things that are going to make it more difficult, and there are things that can make it a little bit easier, and there are things that I'm going to ask you guys to avoid. And the number one thing I'm going to ask you guys to avoid is kind of imagining the texture and making up the texture, or using like shortcuts to show the texture. Right? So this is all about observation, and what I don't want us to start doing is kind of picking something that looks really cool, and then as we start drawing, realizing like, oh, this is going to take a lot of work and a lot of time. Maybe I can just kind of like scribble scrabble in here and that will look right. It won't, because most textures in real life don't look like a scribble scrabble. So whatever animal you have, you end up choosing, you really got to pay attention to, you know, the fine details of its skin or its scales or its fur or whatever covering it happens to have, and just become like really focused in on how it looks. And then the other thing that I would avoid in this project is picking an animal, obviously, that doesn't really have a lot of texture. So most animals do, right? Most animals have some sort of like textured skin covering, or the skin itself has texture. But I mean, I can think of a couple animals that would be really difficult to do for this project. Like if you picked a dolphin or something, right? A dolphin's like really smooth, okay? So technically smooth is a texture, right? But it's not a very interesting texture to draw. So the one thing I want you to avoid is animals that are like really smooth and don't have a lot of like really interesting texture. So animals with feathers are good, animals with like lots of like fur, spiky animals, animals with scales, animals with like wrinkly skin. I think that's enough options for you guys to find an animal that you're really into. The only thing that I'm asking you to avoid is like, you know, dolphins or whales or things that are just kind of smooth and don't have a lot of dynamic, interesting detail texture. So that's the basic outline of the project. What I'm going to do along with this video, I'm going to post up a Google form about just some of the concepts we talked about in this short lesson, and then you guys can go ahead and answer them. I think it'll be like less than 10 questions, so you can go ahead and answer them, And then at the end of that form, there will be a final question for you to upload the reference you're thinking about. So before you start drawing, fill out that form, send me a reference so I know what you're working with, and if anybody picks anything that might be kind of an issue that's in drawing, I can work with them to get a better reference. But go on to your assignments in the new unit on texture, find that Google form, and get started picking out a reference.